For what feels like forever, the US crypto industry has been kind of like the Wild West, right? Just bursting with innovation, but with super confusing rules, and you never knew which sheriff was in town. Well, a huge new piece of legislation, the Clarity Act, is supposed to change all of that. So, what's actually in this bill, and will it finally bring some order to the chaos? Let's break it down. So, here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with the problem that made this law so necessary in the first place. Then we'll look at the Clarity Act as the solution. After that, we'll dive deep into its biggest innovation, a whole new way to classify these assets. We'll also get into what this all means for the industry, and finally, take a peek at what's next on the road ahead. All right, so to really get why the Clarity Act is such a game changer, you have to understand what things were like before. It was a time you could sum up with one phrase: regulation by enforcement. The biggest issue was this thing people called regulatory limbo. Just imagine trying to build a business, but you have no idea which laws apply to your product. And the only way you find out you've broken a rule is when a regulator sues you. I mean, that was the reality for years, and it created this really confusing adversarial environment that just choked innovation. You know, at the very heart of this problem was a massive turf war between two powerful regulators. On one side, you had the SEC arguing that pretty much every digital asset was a security. And they were using a legal test from 1946 that was originally for, get this, citrus groves. Then, on the other side, you had the CFTC, which saw things like Bitcoin as commodities, but its actual authority was pretty limited. This clash left the entire industry caught in the crossfire, creating just a massive amount of uncertainty for everybody. So how do you fix a regulatory mess like that? Well, Congress finally stepped in with a big, comprehensive solution. The whole idea was to replace all that ambiguity with a clear, predictable, rules-based framework. So, meet the Digital Asset Market Clarity Act of 2025, and just look at that vote count, 294 to 134. That is some seriously strong bipartisan support. It really signals that there was a genuine political will to move past all the chaos and finally set up a long-term game plan for digital assets in the US. So, what was the act really trying to do? Well, first and foremost, end regulation by enforcement. And the only way to do that was to draw some really clear lines in the sand between the SEC and the CFTC. The key to the whole thing was creating a brand new classification system for assets based on their function. The goal? Give everybody, developers, exchanges, investors, the legal certainty they've been begging for, and ultimately make sure the US stays a leader in the space. And this brings us to the absolute core of the Clarity Act, its new classification system. This is a complete paradigm shift, moving away from these ancient, outdated tests and toward a framework that actually gets how this technology works. So the Act creates three totally distinct pillars for classifying assets. First, you have digital commodities. These are the decentralized ones, and they're regulated by the CFTC. Second, there are investment contract assets. These are used for fundraising, and they start their life under the SEC. And third, permitted payment stablecoins. These are for payments, and they're overseen by banking regulators. The big takeaway here is that an assets regulator is now decided by its function, what it does, not some clunky one-size-fits-all rule. Let's dig into that first category a bit. A digital commodity is an asset that gets its value from its actual utility on a network. Think of it like fuel for an engine. You need it to make the whole system run. And since it's not like a stock that pays you dividends, it makes perfect sense that it falls under the commodities regulator, the CFTC. Now, this second category, investment contract asset, is super interesting. It's basically designed for projects when they're just starting out. When a team sells tokens to raise money, that whole transaction is treated like a securities offering, so it's under the SEC. But here's the key. The token itself isn't branded a security for life. It's just in this temporary holding pattern under the SEC's watch while the project is still centralized. And finally, we've got permitted payment stablecoins. Now, because these are designed to work just like digital dollars, they get their own special regulatory lane. The companies that issue them are watched over by banking regulators. That's part of another bill, the Genius Act, that works with Clarity. But, and this is important, the SEC and CFTC can still come in and police any fraud in how these stablecoins are being traded. So, how does an asset actually move from one category to another? This is what's called the pathway to decentralization. It's a genius concept in the Act. A project can launch under the SEC, raising money as an investment contract asset. It then gets this grace period, up to 4 years, to mature and grow. Once it can actually prove that it's decentralized, that it's no longer controlled by a small group, the asset officially transitions. It becomes a digital commodity and moves over to CFTC oversight.
This creates a really powerful incentive for people to build truly decentralized networks. Okay, so we've got the theory, the new categories, the whole pathway, but what does all this legislation actually mean for the people building these projects and the exchanges where we all trade these assets? Let's talk about the real-world impact.
So who really comes out on top with all this new clarity? Well, it's pretty much everyone involved. Crypto companies get predictable rules so they can actually innovate. Big institutional investors get that green light they needed to jump into the market with confidence. Retail investors get much stronger protections. And for developers, they finally have a clear legal roadmap. Ultimately, it's about building a stable foundation for the entire industry to grow right here in the US. One of the absolute biggest real-world changes is the creation of a formal, federally regulated spot market. We're talking about the markets where you buy and sell assets for immediate delivery. Before this, crypto exchanges were in this weird gray area with a patchwork of state licenses. The Clarity Act changes that by creating digital commodity exchanges under the CFTC. That means a clear national standard for everyone. And get a load of this number, $75 million. That's a new fundraising exemption that the Act creates. It lets projects raise a significant amount of cash from the public every year without having to go through the incredibly complicated and expensive process of a full SEC registration. This opens up a clear, compliant path for funding these early-stage projects.
And what about the big players, the traditional finance folks? The Act removes a massive roadblock for them. It gets rid of this piece of SEC guidance called SAB 121, which basically made it almost impossible for banks to hold crypto for their clients. By fixing this, the Act makes it way easier for Wall Street to get into the game, which could potentially unlock trillions of dollars in new capital.
But hold on, the story doesn't just end with the House passing the bill. The Clarity Act still has some pretty big hurdles to clear before it actually becomes law, and there's some important questions still hanging in the air. And not everyone is sold that this new framework is perfect. State securities regulators, for instance, have raised some serious concerns. The worry that these new definitions, like digital commodity, might create loopholes that are tough to enforce and could be really easy for fraudsters to exploit. Yeah, and this timeline really shows that the bill is still a work in progress. So it passed the House back in July 2025, but then it hit a bit of a speed bump in the Senate in early 2026. There was some pushback from the industry on details about stablecoins and DeFi. So negotiations are still going on, which means the final version of the law could definitely still change.
It's also really important to see this whole thing in a global context. The US is not operating in a vacuum here. The European Union already has its own huge crypto framework called MiCA, so the Clarity Act is in many ways an answer to that. It's an effort to make sure the US doesn't get left in the dust in this global race to regulate and attract financial innovation.
Which of course leaves us with a million-dollar question. The Clarity Act is without a doubt the most significant step the US has ever taken toward creating a real, functional rulebook for digital assets. But with Senate negotiations still happening and powerful voices on all sides, the path forward is still pretty complicated. So has the US finally found the clarity it needs to lead, or are the biggest challenges still to come?